Introduction to the Gospel of Mark, the earliest account of Jesus. Imagine, dear listeners, a small house in Rome at the end of the 60s in the 1st century. The streets of the empire's capital still bear the marks of the great fire that ravaged the city a few years earlier. Christians, accused by Nero of causing this disaster, live in fear of persecution. It's in this tense context that a man, whom we know as Mark, dips his pen in ink and begins to write on a papyrus scroll. His first words will resonate through the centuries. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. No long genealogy, no miraculous birth narrative. Mark dives straight into the heart of the matter, like a lion roaring in the desert. This abrupt beginning is characteristic of his entire gospel. Direct, fast-paced, urgent. But who was this Mark? The gospel itself gives us no information about its author. However, early Christian tradition is unanimous in attributing this text to John Mark, companion of the Apostle Peter. Papias, bishop of Hierapolis in the early 2nd century, writes, Mark, having become Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, all that he remembered of what had been said or done by the Lord. This John Mark appears several times in the New Testament. He is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles as Barnabas's cousin and a companion of Paul on his first missionary journey. Later, he becomes a close collaborator of Peter, who affectionately calls him my son in his first epistle. Imagine this young man, probably in his 20s during Jesus' ministry, eagerly listening to Peter's accounts of the Master. These memories etched in his mind would form the basis of his gospel years later. But Mark's story is not without twists. The Acts of the Apostles tell us that he abandoned Paul and Barnabas during their first missionary journey, later causing a dispute between the two men. This episode reminds us that even important figures in the early church were human beings with their weaknesses and conflict. The Gospel of Mark is generally considered the oldest of the 4 canonical Gospels. Most scholars date it between 65 and 75 AD, about 35 to 45 years after the events it describes. This temporal proximity to the reported facts gives Mark's Gospel particular historical value. It's our earliest window into the life and ministry of Jesus. But make no mistake, Mark isn't writing a biography in the modern sense. His goal isn't to provide an exhaustive and chronological account of Jesus' life. He's writing a gospel, Greek term meaning good news. His objective is to proclaim who Jesus is and what he has accomplished. Mark's brevity and focus on action, rather than long discourses, have led some to compare it to modern reporting. It gives us the impression of being there, on the ground, following Jesus in his movements and encounters. The Gospel of Mark is remarkable for its dynamic structure and rapid pace. Mark often uses the word immediately, creating a sense of urgency and constant movement. The narrative is built around what's called the messianic secret. Throughout the Gospel, Jesus performs powerful acts that reveal his divine identity, but he often orders those who witness them to keep silent. This secret is fully revealed only at the end, when Jesus is on the cross. It's there, at the moment of his greatest apparent weakness, that his identity is proclaimed by a Roman centurion. Surely this man was the Son of God. This structure creates a dramatic tension that keeps the reader in suspense. It also invites us to reflect. Who is Jesus really to us? How do we react to his words and actions? The messianic secret has been the subject of many interpretations. Some see it as Jesus' strategy to avoid being misunderstood as a political messiah. Others perceive it as Mark's literary technique to maintain suspense. Either way, it adds a dimension of mystery and depth to the narrative. Another interesting aspect of Mark's Gospel is that it seems to have been written for a non-Jewish audience, probably the Christian community in Rome. Mark takes care to explain Jewish customs that might be foreign to his readers. For example, when he mentions that the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands carefully, he adds an explanation about this tradition. He also translates the Aramaic expressions he quotes, such as Talitha kum, little girl get up, or Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? These details remind us that Mark's Gospel played a crucial role in spreading Jesus' message beyond the Jewish world, contributing to making Christianity a universal religion. Mark's attention to cultural details also offers us a fascinating glimpse into daily life in first-century Palestine. We learn about religious practices, political tensions, and even eating habits of the time. The image of Jesus that emerges from Mark's Gospel is particularly striking. Mark presents us with a fully human Jesus who experiences strong emotions, compassion, anger, sadness, and who knows fatigue and hunger. At the same time, Jesus appears invested with divine authority and power. He commands demons, calms storms, heals the sick, and raises the dead. But perhaps the most striking feature of Mark's Jesus is his role as a suffering servant. Mark emphasizes Jesus' mission to give his life as a ransom for many. He reports Jesus' words, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This portrait of the servant Messiah was revolutionary at the time, and it continues to challenge us today. In a world obsessed with power and status, Jesus' example invites us to rethink our understanding of true greatness. Mark also emphasizes Jesus' authority in his teaching. He repeatedly notes that people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. This authority manifests not only in his words, but also in his acts of power. Another fascinating aspect of Mark's Gospel is its portrayal of Jesus' disciples. Far from being flawless heroes, they appear as ordinary men, often slow to understand, sometimes cowardly or selfish. Mark hides nothing of their failures and weaknesses. He reports their petty disputes about who is the greatest, their incomprehension of Jesus' teachings, their abandonment during his arrest. But it's precisely this that makes their testimony credible. Who would have invented such imperfect heroes? And what hope does this give us, who are just as imperfect? Mark's Gospel shows us that God can use ordinary people with their strengths and weaknesses to accomplish extraordinary things. Isn't this a message of hope? Each of us, the disciples' journey in Mark's Gospel is one of growth and transformation. Despite their repeated mistakes, Jesus continues to patiently train them. It's a powerful reminder that spiritual growth is a process, and that God doesn't give up on us despite our failures. One of the most intriguing aspects of Mark's Gospel is its abrupt and enigmatic ending. In the earliest manuscripts, the Gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8. The women, discovering the empty tomb, flee in fear and say nothing to anyone. This open ending has sparked many interpretations. Some think the original ending was lost. Others see it as a deliberate intention of the author, inviting the reader to complete the story with their own response of faith. Either way, this unusual ending reminds us that Jesus' resurrection is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new era. It invites us to ask, what will our response be to this good news? Later manuscripts include longer endings, which recount the appearances of the risen Jesus and his commission to the disciples. These additions, although probably not part of Mark's original text, testify to the early church's felt need to complete the narrative. Mark's literary style is characterized by its vividness and immediacy. He abundantly uses the historical present, a technique that consists of narrating past events in the present tense, which gives the narrative a sense of urgency and immediacy. Mark likes concrete details that bring his stories to life. For example, during the storm on the lake, he mentions that Jesus was sleeping on a cushion in the stern. These little details give the narrative an impression of eyewitness testimony. The evangelist also uses sophisticated literary techniques, such as inclusion, a sandwich structure where one story is inserted in the middle of another, and parallelism. These techniques add depth to his narrative and invite careful reading. Mark's Gospel was probably written in a time of great trouble for the early church. The persecution of Christians by Nero in Rome, the Jewish war against Rome that led to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, all these events formed the background to the writing of the Gospel. In this context, Mark's message about a suffering Messiah and the need for disciples to take up their cross took on a particular resonance. It offered meaning and hope to a community facing adversity and persecution. Mark's emphasis on the messianic secret could also reflect the situation of the early church. In a context of suspicion and persecution, caution in proclaiming Jesus' identity could be a matter of survival. Mark's Gospel has had considerable influence on the other synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their main sources. incorporating much of its content and structure. This theory, known as the Markan priority, underscores the importance of this gospel in shaping the gospel tradition. Although shorter and less theologically elaborated than Matthew or Luke, Mark provided the basic narrative framework for telling Jesus' story. Mark's influence extends well beyond the other Gospels. His portrait of Jesus as a suffering servant has deeply marked Christian theology, particularly the understanding of the significance of Jesus' death. 2,000 years after its writing, Mark's Gospel continues to speak to us with surprising freshness. Here are some aspects of its relevance for our world today. Call to action. In a world often paralyzed by analysis and indecision, Mark's fast pace and emphasis on Jesus' actions invite us to an active and engaged faith. What does it mean for us today to respond immediately to Jesus' call as the first disciples did? A redefinition of power. Portrait of Jesus as a suffering servant challenges our conceptions of power and success. It invites us to a life of service and self-giving. In a world where success is often measured in terms of wealth, fame, or power, how can we embody this alternative vision of leadership and greatness? Hope in difficult times. Written for a community threatened with persecution, Mark's Gospel offers a message of hope in the face of adversity that remains relevant in our troubled world. How can Mark's message help us face the challenges and uncertainties of our time? An invitation to transformation. The journey of the disciples, with their failures and progress, reminds us that spiritual growth is a process. It encourages us to persevere despite our weaknesses. How can we, like the disciples, continue to grow in our understanding and commitment? That's even in the face of our own limitations. A challenge to personal reflection. The central question of the gospel, "Who do you say I am?" invites us to personal reflection on our relationship with Jesus. How do we answer this question today? How does our answer influence our daily life? A demystification of holiness. By presenting Jesus and his disciples in all their humanity, Mark reminds us that holiness is not synonymous with perfection, but with authentic relationship with God. How can this influence our own quest for spirituality? Call to storytelling. Mark's vivid and immediate style reminds us of the power of stories to communicate deep truths. In our digital age, how can we tell Jesus' story in an equally captivating and relevant way? The influence of Mark's Gospel extends well beyond the religious realm. Its narrative style has inspired generations of writers and artists. Its portrait of Jesus as a suffering servant has influenced our understanding of heroism and leadership. In the field of art, many painters have been inspired by the vivid scenes described by Mark. Think, for example, of Rembrandt's dramatic depiction of the calming of the storm, directly inspired by Mark's account. In literature, Mark's influence is felt in the way many authors structure their narrative, creating dramatic tension that keeps the reader in suspense until the final revelation. Even in the field of journalism, we can see the influence of Mark's immediate and vivid style. His on-the-ground approach to storytelling has echoes in modern reporting journalism. In conclusion, Mark's Gospel is not simply a historical document or a religious text. It's an invitation to a spiritual adventure, call to meet Jesus and follow him. With its direct and vivid style, Mark plunges us into the heart of the action. He makes us walk alongside Jesus, share his teachings, witness his miracles, and finally, confront the mystery of his death and resurrection. Whether you're a longtime believer or simply curious to discover who Jesus was, Mark's Gospel offers you a unique and stimulating perspective. It invites you to ask yourself the question, who is Jesus to me? And what difference does it make in my life? As we prepare to dive deeper into this fascinating gospel, I invite you to keep these questions in mind. For the story Mark tells is not just that of Jesus and his first disciples. It's a story that continues to unfold today, in the lives of all those who choose to follow the path traced by the Nazarene. As we conclude this introduction to the Gospel of Mark, we stand on the threshold of an exciting journey. In the upcoming videos, we'll explore Mark's narrative in detail. Starting with the beginnings of Jesus' ministry, we'll see how John the Baptist prepares the way for Jesus, how Jesus is baptized and tempted in the wilderness, and how he begins to call his first disciples. Each setup of this narrative will offer us new perspectives on who Jesus was and what it means to follow him. I invite you to approach this journey with an open mind and a receptive heart. Whether you're familiar with these stories or discovering them for the first time, there are always new truths to uncover, new perspectives to gain. Prepare to be surprised, challenged, and perhaps even transformed as we delve into this ancient but ever-living narrative. For Mark's Gospel is not simply a story of the past, it's a message that continues to speak powerfully to our world today. In our next video, we'll look at John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. We'll see how these events set the stage for Jesus' ministry and what they can teach us about our own spiritual journey. So are you ready to embark on this adventure? Join us for the continuation of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark, the earliest and perhaps most dynamic account of Jesus' life.